guys, welcome back to Lives Vivas. Again, this is my second time filming this Viva. It's a really long story, but whatever. Let's just dive in though. So this week's question is, what does Hildegard von Bingen's life tell us about European culture in the 11th and 12th century? So, although the medieval era is often treated as a monolithical, unified culture, periods within the medieval epoch was full of different cultures and norms. Hildegard von Bingen's life illustrates how increasing stability in the 11th and 12th century allowed Europeans to explore the deeper questions of life. Because life is important and those deep questions need to be answered. So my points are going to be the growing interest in the idea of direct revelation, debate about rationale and faith, and the intellectual and cultural growth. So let's talk a little bit about before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about who Hildegard von Bingen was. So Hildegard lived from 1098 to 1179, and she began her religious life kind of around the ages of 7 or 8. And she became a nun when she was 14, a Benedictine nun when she was 14 with her aunt Jutta. She was unable to write German and had a difficult time with Latin, but if you read her writings, you can just tell they're very creative and very vibrant. So she really loved to learn. She said all of her knowledge came from mystical sources, and she was familiar with the scriptures, natural science, Latin, and the Neoplatonic philosophy. She was taken seriously as a prophet by everybody, and she started to have her visions when she was about 5 years old. So she told everybody that she was spiritually and psychologically sound and healthy and whole during her visions, and that she had 100% consciousness and she knew where she was and everything. She had 2 kind of grades of these visions. One was the living light and the other was the absence or the shade of the living light. So as a young girl, her family had to tithe to the church. They didn't have a lot of money, so they tithed her, and she kind of became this she kind of got sold to the church, and she became an antirote, which was a religious recluse. So people they would have these like kind of box-like structures, which are really small, and people would live in them for years and years, and they would either live in them as a religious recluse, or they would use it also as a punishment for prisoners. So she became this religious recluse. So that's kind of who Hildegard von Bingen was. So let's dive into our first point, which was there was a growing interest in the idea of direct revelation and mystical experiences. So during the 12th century, you can see mystical practice kind of becomes the main practice, and it really flourishes during this 12th century. A lot of people, just grow to like it, and it kind of becomes the norm, as you can say. Hildegard von Bingen and Bernard of Clairvaux. I'm sorry, Sarah, I know we worked on that pronunciation. They were major voices of this new movement of mystical practice and mystical sources. Mysticism did not react as a negative reality, but it became this creative meshing of energy to transform reality, which I thought was kind of interesting. So that's kind of what this was, and Hildegard having these visions kind of really connects with the mysticism. So many people think that Hildegard's visions were caused by visual migraines, because she says that she felt this pain in the back of her head and sees circles. So pain is obviously in the back of your head, that's kind of a headache 101. And seeing circles, though, is part of the visual headache. And so if you look at her paintings and her works of art, which are supposed to be representing her visions, they're very circly, and they have lots of circles, are kind of really a big part of her paintings and her works of art. So Evelyn Enderhill says, quote, "The great period of mystical activity tend to correspond with the great periods of artistic, material, and intellectual civilization," end quote. So again, you can see that the mysticism playing a role in culture and kind of becoming this dominant dominant norm. It plays a part in the artistic and material stuff as well as intellectual, because a lot of smart people become involved with it, and Hildegard starts painting her visions, and so there's just a lot of that. It's all kind of connected. So my second point is that there was a major debate at the time within Christianity between factions, one emphasis on rationalism and the others focused more on the emotional aspect of Christianity. So again, like today, some churches love studying theology and are all about the rituals, and some churches are all about God's presence and experiencing conversions and feeling it in your heart and stuff like that. So Bernard, his theology, along kind of with Hildegard, was just encouraging the intense and profound experience with God and just really feeling God and having this emotional connection with God. As where a famous 12th century teacher named Abelard really focused on reaching God through our rational minds and logic and theology. So one of Bernard's sermons, his fourth sermon called Song of Songs, he uses the verse and the example of kissing Jesus's, from his feet to his hands to his mouth. And he uses this as an example of saying Christianity should be a process, and so you should grow, more intimate with God, as you kissing your feet because he's your Lord, and then you start kissing his hands because you're a little closer with him, and then you can start kissing his mouth, which is kind of weird, but whatever, and so it's just this, progression, getting more and more intimate with Jesus. And he says you can do this through ascetic discipline. So I have two quotes here. One is by Bernard, and it says, quote, "To lose yourself as if you were emptied and lost and swallowed up in God is no human love. It is celestial," end quote. So he, again, just believed that you need to feel God's love and just really embrace God's love and just, really feel the emotional aspects of Christianity. As where Abelard, he says, quote, it is by doubting that by investigating that we come to know the truth," end quote. And so again, his approach was, to investigate and doubt and question and really research what what your theology is, and know who God is through that way. So again, they're very different, and this just led to a lot of differences in churches and differences in theology, just like, we have a lot of that today too. So my third and final point is Hildegard von Bingen was a proto-Renaissance woman. Her position and variety of her academic and aristocratic interests seem to indicate a climate of growing intellectual curiosity and exploration. So this, again, as our thesis stated, that Hildegard's life and her, beliefs and stuff really increased stability during this 11th and 12th century. And as we have learned from previous vivas, the medieval ages was a rough time. It was really chaotic. So this just increased the stability. It allowed Hildegard to kind of rise in power and rise in her ability to talk to people as a theologian, and also to share her knowledge just on everything, because she loved to learn, and so she was a very knowledgeable person in a bunch of different things. So And this was, again, she was a woman, so this was just a very, like, weird, you know, she wouldn't have been able to do this if it weren't for the increasing of stability and just her life in general. So the 12th century, besides Hildegard, was just a really great time for new ideas, produced a lot of new leaders, not a lot of new ideas, and just had a lot of advances. An intellectual renaissance and they all credited this to the past and said that they really built their advances on their past heritage and their past forefathers. So Hildegard was a very knowledgeable woman, and she wrote about a lot, she painted about a lot, had some visions, the basics. But she wrote a couple, she says 1 to 2 natural medical books between 1151 and 1158. So we do not have complete forms of these medical books, unfortunately, but 100 years kind of after her death, anonymous somebody, put together all of her writings into one book called the Physica. So a couple of examples that she uses are the stinging nettle. So this juice, if you squeeze it and get the juice out, it will help with your memory. So if you're losing memory, get some stinging nettle. Some hart's tongue is good for the liver, lungs, pain in the intestines, and poppies were good for sleeping and itching, anything, and lice or gnats, if you have lice or gnats. So today we kind of, have moved away from the natural medications, and because our bodies have just adapted to it over time. However, our bodies are starting to adapt to our new medical, the new medical treatments. So that's why today some more people are having more success with the natural medications versus traditional medicine and stuff like that, because our bodies, have gotten used to the traditional Medicare versus natural Medicare. So we need to flip it. If that makes any sense. I don't know if I really explained that right, but I hope you know what I'm talking about. John of Salisbury says, quote, "We frequently know more, not because we have moved ahead by our own natural ability, but because we are supported by the I can't read my writing. I think it says mental strength of others, and possess riches that we have inherited from our forefathers," end quote. So he is just saying here that they don't think that they, did anything great because this time was so filled with lots of advances and lots of new leaders coming to power, new ideas coming to power. It was because they have looked back in past to see their past mistakes or past successes and use that to advance their lives forward. So, in conclusion, the medieval era can seem as a monolithic, united culture, and with periods of the medieval epic was full of different cultural norms. Hildegard von Bingen's life illustrates the increasing stability in the 12th and 11th and 12th century allowed Europeans to explore the deeper questions of life and what they really believed and their theology, stuff like that. Their 3 points were that there was growing interest in the idea of direct revelation. There was a lot of debate within the church about rationality and faith, and there was a lot of growth intellectually and culturally that really promoted this stability during the 11th and 12th century. Okay, that was a really long Viva. This is way over time. Sorry, Sarah, you have to listen to all 15 minutes of this. But I hope it was worth it. I will see you Wednesday or next week on Lives Vivas. Okay, bye.